Welcome to Season 3 of Voices of Australia, where we embark on a journey through the heart of social cohesion. In this thought-provoking podcast series, we delve into the diverse tapestry of Australian society, weaving together the stories, experiences and perspectives that contribute to our nation's unity. From conversations with community leaders and experts in their fields, to personal narratives of everyday Australians, Voices of Australia Series 3 explores the challenges and triumphs of fostering social cohesion in a dynamic and ever-evolving society. Whether you're a seasoned advocate for social harmony or just beginning to explore the nuances of Australian identity, this podcast invites you to listen, learn and engage in the vital dialogue surrounding social cohesion. Em James is the chair of the Australian Neighbourhood Houses and Centres Association and the former CEO of Neighbourhood Centres Queensland. Having worked in and alongside neighbourhood centres for over 15 years, Em is passionate about bringing the skills, knowledge and insights of local communities and leaders to shape change at the systems level. Em grew up in the regional towns throughout Queensland, and it was a rural youth program funded by a local community centre that first sparked her interest in social change work and creating a better world together. Rosita is currently CEO of the Neighbourhood Collective Australia and founder of the Old Church on the Hill, a treasured community centre in the regional town of Bendigo in Victoria. Rosita has over 20 years of experience in regional community development and cross-cultural work and is an expert in resident-led spaces, community resilience, multicultural affairs, emergency preparedness and regional settlement. Rosita is a Mexican-Australian and migrated with her family to outback New South Wales in the early 70s. Growing up in a remote community with plenty of challenges, Rose knows the strength of resilient communities and the power of belonging. So welcome, Em and Rosita. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to learn a little bit more about what you do and what your organisations do. So I wondered first whether, Em, you could tell us a little about the role of neighbourhood centres in Queensland, but also as the chair of the Australian Neighbourhood Houses and Centres Association, you've also got that national perspective. So I'd really be interested to know a little bit more about what the organisations do.
The Australian Neighbourhood Houses and Centres Association is the national peak of peaks. So it represents over 1,100 neighbourhood and community centres and houses across Australia. So we always say anytime you go past the Golden Arches, you're actually seeing community-based organisations that are doing incredible place-based community leadership work because there's more neighbourhood centres than McDonald's in Australia. Yeah.
Wow, that's a really interesting fact. So that's great to know. And within Queensland, so there's is there any difference between the Queensland neighbourhood houses compared to the profile of neighbourhood houses in other states?
It's really interesting. We'd love to do more research on this. At the moment, it's very much so. There's around 7 other state peaks who we all meet regularly and have had the chance to visit each other's kind of conferences and houses across Australia, which has been an amazing privilege to get to see the incredible work of neighbourhood centres and houses. And I mean, a lot of the differences are very around policy in terms of how they're funding and how that structure then impacts the type of work that those centres do. And then, of course, across, I guess it's a fascinating insight into different neighbourhoods. So we say each neighbourhood centre is the reason that we have a shared approach is because we are based in and made up of the skills, assets, challenges and opportunities of our particular geographic areas and regions. So we just see that across Australia, whether you're in a very small rural area, which then I think often becomes a very strong hub. It might actually be the only community service where co-located services and all those sorts of things, as opposed to in a more urban setting where they might be one of a portfolio of different community services and supports available, with that key difference being that neighbourhood centres are community-based, so often have a community governance structure, and in that way we really work towards neighbourhood centres being really governed by and informed by local people and their needs and aspirations.
Fantastic, thank you. Rosita, I'd ask you the same question about the Neighbourhood Collective Australia. Tell us a little bit more about what it does, and then also your role at the Old Church on the Hill in Bendigo.
Yeah, Neighbourhood Collective Australia is I'm co-CEO there, working part-time, and we are have a couple of roles. One is a statewide role, and one is really based in our neighbourhood. And the one that's on the ground locally is curating a space called the Old Church on the Hill, which is a really vibrant space, and we come from a strength-based, asset-based community development approach. So looking at how to work with communities in a way that looks at what's strong and strengthens that to address what's wrong with communities, rather than that kind of traditional way of looking at what the gaps are, what's wrong, what are the needs there in a community, and how can we address those. So yeah, that's part of what we've been doing. I've been working there in Bendigo, in Victoria for 15 years, and around that space, and part of that, part of the crew at the heart of that, the community at the heart of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosita. Now, Bendigo, of course, is a regional town. So have you found that was there a particular need to, or was there literally a strength within Bendigo that you wanted to harness, which was to do with resident activities and that community awareness of how important that was?
I'd have to say that when I first came to Bendigo, I didn't know a soul, and it was difficult with kids going to schools where we didn't know it, people where nobody knew my family or background. It was really hard to actually connect and find my tribe or people to connect with. And but over the last 15 years since being there, there's been a lot of change happening. And I think in Bendigo, you have kind of people who were born and bred there, who obviously are part of a very strong, very rural community in many ways. And then you have new people that are arriving mostly from Melbourne, and finding it hard to find that place to be able to sort of connect and belong. And I think part of the challenge of Bendigo is actually its closeness to Melbourne, because it's only an hour and a bit down the road, and it's very easy for people moving up to actually keep their roots, their kind of sense of belonging, connection there in Melbourne, and to have one foot in Bendigo, and in over time they end up with one foot in Bendigo and one foot in Melbourne, and it's really hard for them to feel at home and a sense of belonging. And one of the things I hear over and over again at the Old Church on the Hill are people saying just how this has helped them to be able to get their other foot out of Melbourne and put both feet into the town that they're in, and to have that sort of sense of connection and belonging.
Fantastic. So you have sort of a view across neighbourhood houses across, from rural, regional and metro. Do you find that there's any particular difference between the way that they operate, or do they have this role in helping people to transition from one place to another?
I think Rosita's shared beautifully with that beautiful example of Bendigo. And I do think that is very similar wherever you are. And I mean, even just looking at the definitions of neighbourhood around that kind of, it is the spaces where we spend our daily lives. It's within walking distance. It's who we bump into at the coffee shop. It's whether or not we have access to a library, and just how those things then form that kind of social landscape or part of belonging. And then obviously from my perspective, then that role of something like a neighbourhood centre or a space where people then, that is, I think as Rosita mentioned as well, that third space where people can gather and really talk about their dreams and hopes, what they want to see, and bring that to fruition. In my neighbourhood, actually in Yeronga, it's very flood prone. So a lot of our neighbourhood centre, when the recent floods happened, or 2 years ago now, but it still feels very recent in Yeronga. Again, it was that example of, even though it's the inner city, of people really mobilising together, and then of the neighbourhood centre being activated so people could drop off the baked goods, they could come and volunteer, so as well as seek help and support and make sense of what had happened all together, and that work continues over such a long time. And so I think it's having these places where we can go, just when we need, it might not when we need something, and it might just be the need to contribute. And I was reflecting on that after the flooding, where often just that role of being able to volunteer was part of the healing process for our community as well. So just the ability to have a place to contribute after something like a flood happens is in of itself a gift that neighbourhood spaces can offer to community that, again, helps to build that sense of shared belonging, shared participation, and creating something together.
And Rosita mentioned how important a strengths-based approach is. How would you sort of talk to that particular importance? Are you finding that everybody that's understands that focusing on a neighbourhood strengths, on individual strengths, is actually the best way forward, rather than thinking that everybody that you're working with has some sort of a deficit?
Absolutely. Nobody wants to walk in the door or talk to someone who sees them as a problem. We all want to be seen as a person, and we want to work with other people. And again, that, I feel like I'm already sounding like a broken record, but on that role of having, it's not a paid service. Someone isn't paid to care for me, but creating opportunities for people to care for each other, whether that's your neighbour that you're checking on, whether that's the friendly smile or that sense of safety in a community that means people are more likely to just have a chat with each other if they're at the traffic lights. And just those ways of being, which start small and can really end up in incredible shared community activities, whether that's a community garden, a history group, a local business association. Just what are the ways that we connect and support each other as people outside of that more service world, which has a really important role. But I think in the context of neighbourhoods, so much of it is about what are the opportunities to really meet each other, to be seen as fellow humans, and to matter and to value, and to have something to contribute. So, for example, when I was running New Farm Neighbourhood Centre, we had someone who was living at the local boarding house, so it's down on his luck, was a chef, and he would come in every day, would get the food from Oz Harvest donated. He would come in, he'd set to work with other people and just start cooking up these amazing meals. So even though he was, in this moment of his life where he was really needing a lot of support, he was also offering his support and skills to build that really strengths-based, just where it was a mutual contribution. And I think that's really valuable.
Absolutely. Rosita, the term social cohesion gets bandied about a lot right now, and we don't necessarily all have a common definition, but I'd be interested in how you interpret social cohesion and as Em just pointed out, that importance of dignity in relation to how we interact with each other.
Certainly from my perspective, social cohesion happens when people discover what they have in common and celebrate the things that they don't have in common, or appreciate the differences that are there in each other, whether it's cultural, faith, all sorts of ways of coming from whatever way of life you've come from, wherever you are, that you're welcome, you're included, you're part of it. I think inclusion is a really important part. It's not just about having so social cohesion doesn't just happen. You can have a lot of diversity, you can have a lot of difference there in a community, but if there isn't inclusion alongside that, if there is an opportunity to actually, like Em was saying, participate, not just sort of attend things and be alongside other people, but actually have opportunity to contribute and to connect, then social cohesion doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite can happen. It can actually become a problem rather than something that's beautiful. So social cohesion is something that we need to work at all the time. It's something that is curated. It is something that we lead by example. It doesn't just happen. Yeah, and we need, like we've talked about already, we really need those spaces that are not work and that are not home, where we feel at home and where people can connect with the other, in that sense. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm interested to know from both of you, but Rosita, just while we're talking, whether or not you think there are any particular characteristics about the Australian way, if you like, or this. Or how Australians, if you like, approach the world, that actually is the rationale behind why we are such a cohesive society? Are there things that you see that are simply Australian, if you like, in inverted commas, that come to bear when we start engaging with people in our own neighbourhoods?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure about that. I think there's probably like I grew up in Burke, migrated there from Mexico with my family when I was a little girl and became part of that town. And I know that that's shaped a lot of who I am now and how I work. I've seen the strength of that, I guess, traditional Australian community where people are not really depending on services so much and on organisations, on government to do things, but are actually needing each other, you know, in ways that that help strengthen the community. So yeah, I think
that sort of self-reliance.
Yes, self-reliance, I think, and also too, like I remember a couple when I was growing up, they were actually American, but they started the year with a big barbecue and bush dance at their place, and they made like the ice cream, you know, churned ice cream there for anyone that was new to town, any of the new police, any of the new teachers, any of the new people that came were just invited along to this farm for a big celebration. I don't know how many hundreds of people would have been there, but I know that sort of not waiting for others to do things, that sort of get in proactive. I mean, they were American and they brought their culture into this space, but I know I appreciated that model, I guess, to community. Yeah. Also too, just thinking about it, my son travelled for the first time to Mexico as just a young adult, and he called me from Mexico and said, "Mum, we need to live here." He just said, our community is just so everybody's doing it and nobody's thinking about it. There's no one sort of making anything happen. It's just here. It's here. And I think in some ways, that's one of the differences that I can see with communities that come and multicultural communities that we work at. At the old church, we work really hard at keeping the multicultural communities at the heart of this wider community space. We put resources into that to remove barriers and to make sure that's kind of happening at the heart. But yeah, I think what Marshall had recognised was that actually in some cultures that's already happening.
It's an automatic default, yes.
It's an automatic default, yeah.
So Em, do you think some of those things have contributed to what is the Australian character now?
I definitely agree with what Rosita's been saying. And I guess I have increasingly been thinking around this story that we're sold, that we're separate individual entities, and that's a very particular culture, or a colonising culture, I suppose, that I think we're still grappling with as a society. You know, I think I might leave it there. I'm still formulating. It was a really good question, and also there's just so much change that I see at the moment that I don't think I've formed a clear response yet.
That's absolutely fine. So when you think about social cohesion from your perspective, Em, how would you define that? How would you define social cohesion? Another one of those tricky questions, huh?
Yeah. Well, think about this quote, which I didn't know it's actually from Mother Teresa, which I didn't realise, but it's about how violence is when we forget we belong to each other. Mm-hmm. So I've just been thinking a lot lately around belonging and what it means as a culture, as a society, as a community to remember that we belong. We might be extremely different from each other, but as science shows us increasingly, as multiple faith traditions are always pointing us towards, we do belong to each other. And as soon as we forget that, as soon as we can walk past somebody, you know, who doesn't have shelter, there's a lot of people currently experiencing just terrible levels of lack of affordable housing, for example. And until we remember that we're all part of that challenge, even though I have a house, that the fact that in our society we're creating processes and systems where it's possible for others to be experiencing such a different reality. It's a challenge.
We have social cohesion. I guess, sorry, like I said, I'm still grappling with it myself, but it's just been that quote that I've been sitting with, which is the violence is when we forget we belong to each other. Yeah. And in some ways, I guess the definition of social cohesion is remembering that we belong to each other. And at that real neighbourhood level, how that manifests in ways that we interact, talk with each other, that dignity and respect regardless of
your context and situation, but just recognising that basic human worth and dignity of each person.
Absolutely. Do you feel, because over time our neighbourhoods, whether it's in the metro or rural or regional, have actually changed, and they're changing, or at least they're evolving on different elements over time. Have you noticed that the need for the type of programs that neighbourhood houses run have also changed over time?
Good question. Unfortunately, a lot of what we're seeing, at least in the Queensland context, is a much higher demand on that more service level. So people really needing access to food. So that increase in neighbourhood centres offering and the volume of food and other supports that's being offered to Queensland communities, I think it's more than doubled in the last, we do an annual survey. And so that's just been extremely noticeable, these just increases in people who might be trying to have multiple jobs and still can't afford to have food on their table and a roof over their head. So that is extremely noticeable. And then one of the challenges that we've been wrestling with as part of that real community development ethos, which we've been really working hard to celebrate and to increase in our neighbourhood centres and the way that we think about the work that we do. But it becomes challenging as people need their basic needs to be met, to then also create space for people to work together and to look at how things could be happening differently at that local level, and to think more creatively about how we respond to the problem of hunger in our community, whether that's a food cooperative or a community garden. But when someone's very hungry, sometimes you do just want to be able to give somebody a food voucher. So that's been part of what we've been dealing with, is that need for people to have basic services while also wanting to be part of creating a different, more beautiful world, even as we see these challenges continue to grow.
Yeah, and I guess it's part of it is finding how we can help build optimism into people's lives, rather than simply, just coping. But how do we help those individuals that might be having a tough time feel at least reasonably optimistic that the future might be a bit different to what it is now?
Exactly. All in it together, or feeling supported by other people in their community. We're not alone. It's a shared challenge. It's still a horrible challenge, but it's a shared challenge. It's not the problem or the fault of an individual. It's systemic challenges that we need to respond to together. Rosita, you must be seeing this I was curious to see how it's landing for you.
Say that it is very much like that. We've seen, just with particularly for people that are lower socioeconomic, coming from that background, but not only. We're noticing others that are really needing those services more. And one of the things we've done is just in the last year has been to set up a growers market alongside. We have a little community pantry. We also have what we call a sharing table. So we've been trying to sort of, how do we meet that need that's there, that gap that's there, but in a way that's kind of strength based and that's not kind of how do we change that? So we've been exploring all sorts of things, and some things are working and some things aren't. But we set up a sharing table where people can bring any produce that they have to share an abundance of what they have, but they can also take, and we've partnered with our local food share org to be able to do that. And we've tried to focus mainly on fresh fruit and vegetables. That is kind of the feel of it. Then we also have a community pantry where we support regional growers, and that's also been, we're noticing that people that wouldn't normally choose to buy a local are actually buying local, because everybody's doing it and it's accessible and affordable because we're buying it in bulk together. So yeah, it's been definitely a challenge to sort of keep that. The service is definitely there and we're seeing it, but how do we approach that in a way that's going to be less of a charity kind of feel and more of an empowering kind of
Yeah, Rosita, it's really interesting to think about Bendigo, because Bendigo's gone through a lot of changes, as you indicated before. You've moved from more traditional views about things into sort of somewhat more progressive. The council has really shifted, particularly after the issues with the mosque. And then you've got a huge hospital being built in Bendigo as well that's brought a whole lot of people into the neighbourhood. How have you...
I was going to say the current Premier is based in Bendigo as well.
That's true. That too. So a whole lot of those different sort of external factors that are changing around you. How has the Neighbourhood Collective evolved over that time? And have you got any examples about particular ways that the ones that you've just mentioned have worked, or those that haven't worked?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of change for us as well. The Old Church on the Hill is a volunteer-run space, and it's been around since 2013, a little bit before that. But we have incorporated as an organisation Neighbourhood Collective Australia to support the community around the Old Church on the Hill just in the last few years, in order to be able to respond to some of those bigger needs that we're seeing in the community around us. Bendigo's become multicultural. I think it started off very much through the gold rush, very multicultural, but it's been a very white conservative town. And so it's been in the last 15 years that we've seen new communities settle in there. We've found all sorts of things helpful. One has been to run what we call Feast of Stories, and that's on a Friday night. It costs $5. It's something that's affordable for anybody. But what we've done there is we've had different communities come, or different people from the community come and cook a beautiful meal. And we've often had a local musician come and sing beautiful songs. And then we've had 3 storytellers come, usually from the community that the food is coming from. We've seen a real strength in storytelling. And I think, Em, you mentioned story before as well. And I know we see a lot of change happening in a really positive way to the big changes that are happening at a societal level through bringing together community and having an opportunity to be able to hear each other's stories and to be able to connect with our own stories as well. So that might be a story about, like, the theme might be something like new beginnings or journey, or something like that's going to create people sort of thinking about, well, everyone's got a story, everyone's been on a journey, everyone's had a new beginning. Let's reconnect with those stories and let's understand what makes other people tick, and get a little window into a little more of their lives. And I think what we're seeing is really beautiful social cohesion and change happening in ways that we're surprised about as well, through that exchange of storytelling and people connecting to that. That would be one example. The sharing table would be another. Even the growers market, supporting those connections between people and the food and where that's coming from. COVID kind of started that happening, but it's been a really good something that's been a good response to those sort of bigger changes that are happening. We're seeing people really craving community in ways that I've never seen before. We know we're made for community. We know we need it. We need the opportunity to connect with community. But what I'm seeing for the first time is people really, really needing that. Yeah, I'm surprised about that.
Yeah, that collaboration and interaction is so important. And just picking up on that, the storytelling piece, we know how important sharing stories is, because it helps others to recognise the similarities or commonalities that they've got across the board. So are you finding that within the neighbourhood houses generally, or specifically any particular examples that you're aware of, where storytelling has been particularly pivotal?
I loved all of Rosita's examples, and we do have similar little projects across Queensland as well. Again, that kind of creativity of neighbourhood centres, it's lovely to hear that across Australia. In terms of the power of storytelling, what's actually coming to mind is some of the more sort of community organising pieces, which is around bringing people together in sort of world cafes to have conversations around what matters to them in their communities, and then using that to build into some of those larger place-based funded initiatives that we're seeing, including out at Logan and other areas around Queensland. But definitely the starting point for a lot of those work pieces is bringing people together to talk about what matters to them across different, and then look at, well, what is at the heart of this that we all care about, and what can we agree that we want to work on together moving forward.
I think that's such an important point, that opportunity that neighbourhood houses provide to bring people together to talk about common issues and the sorts of things that they would like to see improved within their neighbourhood, because that enables them to, one, have a voice, but also to see their voice actually resonate with others that might need to be involved. I'm interested in whether or not you've had an opportunity to have an influence over local councils, and what you think you would like to see local councils and neighbourhood, how you would like to see that interaction between neighbourhoods and local councils sort of strengthened. So, Em, any thoughts on that?
It's interesting because so much of, I think when they work very well together, neighbourhood centres and local governments can just achieve amazing things together. So we definitely have some neighbourhood centres that are actually based in local government buildings, for example. I think what's tricky when we talk about neighbourhood centres is these arbitrary geographical lines or wards of council, and how sometimes they just don't correlate at all with people's sense of identity of this is my place, and how that links into a more political and or administrative component. But I think, and I also think there's a funding issue for councils. So I think what I would like to see more and more is more decision-making devolved to local communities, which I think can be well facilitated by council. So sometimes council are also being instructed by state or federal government around that money distribution or availability. But I think to be able to have those conversations, really meaningful conversations around what money is entering into a community or a geographic area, what's the best spend of that, and where that's being duplicated or isn't actually what people are saying that they need or want. What are the conversations that we can have, that more deliberative governance conversation? What skills do we need at the community or even local government level to be able to have those conversations? There's been some interesting examples in Brisbane with people kind of doing participatory budgeting. So in the council being like, here's how much money we have for the year, and then having actual conversations with citizens in that electorate around, well, how do you think this can best be spent, and what is most important to you? And then what that means to communities in terms of what they see in their neighbourhoods can be really powerful. And again, that sense of connection and the link between place to these broader processes of government is really powerful.
It is, and it's a great recognition of the role that neighbourhood houses can play in pulling people together and getting them to feel really confident about participating in those types of communications with council, so that they do feel much closer to the decisions that are being made. Rosita, the Bendigo Council is a member of Welcoming Cities as well. So do you find that they are really recognising the role that the Neighbourhood Collective and of course the Old Church on the Hill can play in galvanising people more broadly within the community to the sorts of things that you would like to see them move further along in regard to the sorts of things that make a difference?
I think Bendigo Council has definitely started a journey in that direction, and I think there's been some amazing change just in my time in Bendigo. I've seen that change in terms of how council works with community. I think probably from my perspective, they are on a journey. Like there is still distance to travel. There is still work to be done. For me, I think councils, and like I said, Bendigo is a good example, but I know that it's not the same across the state. But I think councils really recognising and valuing that role of those grassroots community spaces, and for more than just community consultation. I think they know that we know how to connect with communities. So when they need consultation now, I'm really glad to see that they're working with grassroots communities to get that sort of feedback. As opposed to when I think they first started here, I remember actually giving some feedback to council and saying, council, you're putting on all these great free community events and consultations. You're wondering why no one's coming to them. Have you seen where you're running these? Like they're all in the beautiful, Bendigo's got the most glorious, beautiful buildings, but they're all sort of designed for middle class, upper class. I mean, sometimes I don't feel comfortable in some of those places. What do I have to do? Where do I fit in? And so I've seen a real change there in where they're coming. I think it needs to move beyond community consultation. I think they need to understand more and more about the role that these grassroots organisations, and also to a lot of, like in the multicultural world, a lot of these community groups that are actually vital for creating change and social cohesion and for communication and for all of that. It's often unincorporated community groups that are not really easy to work with because they're not incorporated. And I think there needs to be a lot more understanding, a lot more work done there to be able to really value the importance of those sort of grassroots organisations. I think to understanding better the connection between grassroots organisations and top organisations, like I think they play a similar role. Like Em said, services and community, they're really vital. Services are important, but they can't replace community. We say we don't wrap services around clients. We actually want to wrap community around people, and the services can come along and help community in doing that and strengthen and add to. There'll be things that they can do that community can't do. In a similar way, grass tops organisations, they're easy to give funding to. They're easy to work with from from the government approach, but they're often about building their organisation, building their, like a lot of that can be lost and doesn't actually make a difference on the ground to those grassroots communities. So there's a lot of challenges in that space to be working at that level, but that's kind of the level where I feel like I'm in that space, and I wish that government, local government particularly, would understand that and support that space a lot more.
Oh, it's beautifully said. Em, does that resonate with you as well?
Absolutely. Yes.
The way you've described it is very real. It's something that you can actually really see very clearly in your mind's eye, and I think as a vision for where we go to, and the role that neighbourhood houses, neighbourhood centres might have. That's a really clear demonstration of what that might look like. I'm wondering whether or not during COVID there was a need for neighbourhood houses, neighbourhood centres to really step up and fill particular voids. Do you think that we've captured the learnings or the sort of the opportunities that were created through that sufficiently well? Now it's post the pandemic, and I'll tell you one thing that comes to mind is that now that we're coming up to Anzac Day, there was, during the pandemic, there was an opportunity where, because you couldn't all gather, that people were encouraged to stand at the end of their driveways as with a candle as a symbol of their support for Anzac Day. And yet that sort of dispersed or more distributed activity or neighbourhood activity seems to have dropped off. And so I'm just interested in whether or not you think there are things we should have learned during that pandemic time that we should be trying to carry on now, or even the role of technology in the way that we operate. So, Em, what do you think about that?
In a strange way, what I think about with the COVID, amongst all of its challenges, was that people really were regrounded in their communities, literally within 5 kilometres, really having to re-explore and re-enter that space, and also not having those same travel responsibilities or all these things that for some people did create extra space to really re-engage with their community, to have to slow down to that point. That was not true for many people, but I think in terms of the stories that we saw, there's that value of having that time to be in community and to be localised in place. And at the same time, I think what we also saw, which Rosita mentioned as well, was that it was kind of grassroots organisations and local community-based organisations. And this is the data I wish was more readily captured, is they were the ones who were able to figure out a way to support their community, often with 24 hours notice. They'd reopened in another way. Like my local community centre was still serving meals just via a little window fridge box that people could safely get to, or I forget, they had beautiful ways. They were doing like a cook at home series, so they'd make little cooking packets that people could cook together at home. All of these beautiful ways of still connecting people. And again, no shade on the larger organisations, but because of those much larger procedural, bureaucratic procedures, those larger organisations often did close for a lot longer. And it was the community-based organisations that were able, due to their size, due to their connections to local community and people, were really able to be there and to respond really quickly and to really understand what was happening in their community, which people might be more vulnerable or need a check-in, all of those different things. So I think we really did see the power of neighbourhoods and of supporting community organisations who do know that. And
No, that's great. I was only going to say one of the things that our MAPI social cohesion research demonstrates is how much people feel connected in their communities. And I think it's organisations such as yours, Em, and yours, Rosita, that really do demonstrate why that's the case. There are so many, there are people working actively within neighbourhoods to really strengthen that collaboration, that interaction between individuals, and all of that makes an enormous difference to social cohesion. So I would like to thank both of you very much for having been a part of this conversation. It's been terrific. I've really learned an awful lot myself, but really find talking to both of you most really motivating and very fulfilling. So thank you very much. Keep doing what you're doing. It's absolutely necessary, but thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to our Voices of Australia podcast. For more episodes like this one, you can visit the Scanlon Institute website at scanloninstitute, or one word, .org.au.